So, welcome everyone to the BCLT Berkeley Law Student Career Series. We have another wonderful program today. Wilson Sonsini has volunteered more of its time to talk about something that I think is overlooked, especially in today's world where OCI has kind of disappeared, or no, not disappeared. My friends in the Career Development Office may not appreciate that, but it's less relevant. It used to be that if you avoided networking, you're is a 1L, you'd be fine if you went to OCI. Now, a lot of those jobs may be gone before OCI starts. And so it means the ability to network early on is important, and for a couple reasons. One, to meet people, understand the firm, but also to understand practice areas that as a 1L, you're not exposed to yet. Privacy, tax law, you're going to be picking a group and a career path. You're not stuck with it, but you're going to be picking based on something you have minimal exposure to. How do you get that exposure? These events. Firms are holding more, dinner events, more events at their offices. Law firms are doing more. Law schools are doing more to hold these events. But I see people squander these opportunities because maybe they don't understand the difference between socializing and networking. Who better to kind of guide that difference than those that are in charge of recruiting and see everything? It's people always think the attorneys are knowledgeable, but when it comes to recruiting, the recruiting department at law firms, they see everything, not just their little slice of candidates. They see best practices, they say horrifically bad practices, and understand how to make the process work across people that are first generation, people that are experienced networkers, just a lot of ways to smooth the process. So that's a long-winded way of saying this may be the most important set of skills you can have. You can understand what practice or what questions you want to ask, but if you don't know how to get them out and don't know how to get the answers back, and you don't know who to approach, doesn't matter that you have great questions. You've got to really start with this process early on. And if you're relying purely on interviews anymore as 1Ls in this new kind of accelerated OCI world, I think you're behind. So I may be completely wrong. That's why we have an expert here. That's why Wilson was willing to volunteer its time to kind of help students nationwide. So we have Shereen Nikzad from the San Diego office of Wilson Sonsini. Spends a lot of her time in the Bay Area, but I think this is interesting because you're going to see, is this a California practice? Is this a Southern California? Or is this really national in how you approach these things? So Shereen, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to help our students, to help students across the country. Times are changing, so.
Yeah, thanks so much, Wayne. Excited to be here and excited to talk a little bit about networking.
So I want to just start off with, how do you choose who to network with at a firm? You go to events, you see people, you can't talk to them all, you can't rush them all and start writing down notes. What do you do? How do you start with these types of professional networking events?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think on some level, it depends on how you're engaging in this networking. So say you've been invited to a reception at a law firm. They have a ton of their different attorneys there. You're going in there with several other law students. You may not know what attorneys are going to be there and who you're going to have the opportunity to talk to. So if you're in a setting like that, I think it's important beforehand to do a little bit of research on the firm and especially the office of the firm you're going to. So if you were going to my San Diego office, you might do a little bit of research and learn that we mostly practice in corporate patent litigation, and TTG bio, and have that in the back of your mind when you arrive. So that way, when you get there, you can try and seek out TTG bio, which is technology transactions biotechnology attorneys when you arrive, or you can seek out a corporate attorney when you arrive. And have some background of who the firm is when you go in there. Of course, maybe you end up in a conversation with a patent litigator, and that's not something that you had previously had interest in, but you can also use that as a great way to kind of say, learn more about patent litigation and also ask them, who here is practicing in corporate, would love to meet someone, and they can make that introduction. On the flip side, if you're trying to do some maybe what we call like cold calling, which is not actually usually phone calling, but cold outreach with attorneys at firms you're interested in. The key point there is you want to look for people that you have connections with. So say you've been to an on-campus panel and you heard one of our privacy attorneys talking, and you didn't get a chance to speak to them afterward, but you thought they had a lot of really interesting things to say. That's a great person to reach out to. If you haven't had a chance to meet, someone from the firm you're interested on campus yet, you can still go on their website and do a little bit of research. So a great starting point are people who are alums of the law school and or undergraduate school you attend. If you go to Berkeley Law, there are going to be a lot of Berkeley Law attorneys at firms across the nation who are really interested in speaking with you because you have that shared affinity. And the same thing goes for your undergraduate school. You might be able to find out that you have connections otherwise. So say you did concert violin for several years. The internet is a wonderful resource. You may be able to find an attorney who did something similar and might be interested in talking with you because you share that background. And you also can't understate the importance of, speaking to people in either geographies or practice areas that you're most interested in. 1L coursework does tend to be extremely litigation focused. And so a lot of 1Ls, when they're trying to figure out what they want to do, once they actually have the JD and have moved on to practice, are looking to explore things outside of that litigation space. So if you want to talk to a tax attorney, most firm websites are really good about having, filters where you can go in and see everyone who practices in tax law. So identify someone who does that. And then again, geography is really important. If you grew up in Seattle and you are really interested in going back there to practice after you complete law school, definitely, look for attorneys in the Seattle office to talk to. And be open to speaking to attorneys from a variety of different experience levels. So junior associates are a really good resource if you want some insight into what it's like to recently have been hired by the firm and to have gone through the interviewing process with them and to be just starting your career. And mid-level to senior associates are going to be your greatest mentors. When people come to be summer associates at our firm, their mentor assigned to them is usually someone at that level, and that often tends to be a lifelong mentor. So those are awesome resources too, and partners are of course great as well. And then I will put in a shameless plug for recruiters. Whether you're at in-person events or you're doing kind of cold outreach, there will probably be some sort of recruiting presence there. We have a really good wealth of knowledge about what's going on at our firm at a very high level. We tend to have the most information about what it's actually like to apply here and what the summer program is like. And all of those kind of higher level questions that you might have about the process. So definitely don't overlook your recruiters because they are a great resource as well.
So I think you undersell the value of recruiters. I spent my life in law firms, and what I learned is to lean on recruiters. If it's a partner, the recruiters know more on both sides of the process. As a partner, I would turn to the recruiters and say, well, what do you think about this person? How did they handle things? What did you see? And I was always interested in that data because comparative wise, they saw more than any individual lawyer ever did. I saw 25 candidates a cycle. They saw 250, and it did it consistently for years and years and years. So recruiters, in my mind, are the most valuable resource a lawyer has on judging candidates, and vice versa. Or I guess on the other side of the coin, it's the most valuable resource really that any law student can have is ask those questions to the recruiters. And if they don't know the answers or they don't want to answer them, sometimes it's not there, what does somebody do day to day? Well, let me put you in touch with the right person. Great directors of traffic. You just have to rely on them. And I think it's beyond a resource. I think it's a silly mistake not to rely on recruiters. They're going to guide you to the people that are most knowledgeable and in the right areas, maybe have something to share that you wouldn't think about asking. I've seen recruiters say, seed great questions. Go ask X person about their transition from litigation to tax transactions. Never ask that normally, but then there's something to be learned. So of everything there, I think students sometimes overlook recruiters as maybe the most single valuable resource they have on understanding firms, because the recruiters are there to help They're not there. I mean, they're there to help you find a path to whatever firm you need to find a path to. It may not be theirs, but they're going to guide you with good information or get you that good information. So so I'm going to see your shameless plug with my own over the top praise, but sometimes people don't seem to hear the fact that recruiters are valuable. And I think the smaller the office, the more valuable the recruiter is. Sometimes in a big office with 400 lawyers, the recruiter doesn't know everybody. I would be willing to bet you know more about everyone in your office than you probably care to some days. So a great resource to help on those types of things. So there were a couple of other things that I wanted to pull out of the discussion. You mentioned be open to different experience levels. Tell me a little bit more about what you see there, what the value of it is, and what the mistake might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time, and understandably so, 1Ls and law students who are early in their careers really want to speak to partners. Because in their mind, partners are the ones who set the vision of the firm and have the best insights into things. And my partners are fantastic, and they are great people to talk to, and I enjoy speaking with them, and they're great networkers. But they are not the only ones who have valuable insight. And in some ways, associates tend to have more relevant insight into things that 1Ls really want to know when selecting a firm. So, like I said, for many partners, it's been over a decade since they went through the summer recruiting process, sometimes several decades since they went through the process. So if you have questions of, what it's like to be a summer associate at X firm, or what opportunities are there for juniors to get training at your firm, or how can junior associates be involved in pro bono at your firm, you're much better suited to be speaking, to a junior associate who's gone through that recently and can speak to that experience. And, at the same time, mid-levels and senior associates really are, the key mentors in the future of any given firm that you're working at, because you're going to be hopefully at the firm you select for a long time in your career. And so partners are going to retire, and those mid-level to senior associates are going to become the partners you primarily work with as you advance through your career. So they tend to, they've been there long enough to where they really know the ropes and they really know what's going on in their given practice groups. And they have good connections with the partners. So they have the insights that the partners have, from their vantage point, while also, again, having the ability to be really well integrated at all levels of the firm, and provide those kind of core insights on, what direction is the practice group heading in? What kind of mentorship opportunities are available to me? How can I grow myself in this career? If I see myself wanting to be partner at a firm, how do I get myself on that path? And other things like that.
It is an often overlooked concept that mid-level senior associates really are much closer in day-to-day practice to what a first-year lawyer is going to be doing. And I can say it more bluntly, partners at 20 years, 25 years out don't remember what it was like to interview as a summer associate and don't really remember what it was like to be a 1L or 2L. And if they did, the 1L or 2L task of 25 years ago probably aren't the same as the 1L, 2L task of today. At some point, I often tell my students that, it's magic. I had these great attorneys around me and I'd say, I need this done by Thursday at 5 o'clock. And it would show up at Thursday at 5 o'clock. Just amazing how that worked. How it got there, I kind of had some idea, but I couldn't tell you the exact process. And I never needed to tell you the exact process because I didn't micromanage. But then if somebody came to an interview and asked me, I couldn't tell them what it would be like to be a second year day to day. I knew some things. I knew how I could help. But the second year's mentor was a 6th year. The 6 year's mentor was a junior partner. Junior partner's mentor was me. Just kind of the way law firms match up. So I always tell people, if they won't let you talk to the junior or mid-level and senior associates, run. They know more than all the partners about what your life will look like. So I love that, talk to people of different levels. The other point you made is across practice groups. Inevitably, you're going to be in an event where there are lots of lawyers, or sometimes there are only going to be a couple lawyers from a particular firm that may or may not be in your group that you're interested in. That doesn't mean they don't have valuable information. So I'd love to know a little bit more there about, if I'm interested in privacy and regulatory privacy, but the only person here from Wilson for this particular event is a patent litigator, happens to be from the same office that I'd like to work in. How do I network in that particular instance?
Yeah, that's a really good question because especially, when you're meeting people at, say, an on-campus event, there might only be one or two people from the firm there, and there's a good chance it's, not necessarily from the top choice practice group that you're most interested in. I think, it's twofold. When you're first getting into that conversation and you're probing, what this person's background is, those folks are still a really good resource to answer questions that are a bit more general about the firm. What is the firm culture like? What type of practice groups are represented in your office? How did you get to be at this firm? What attracted you to the firm? And then, a lot of firms work very, cross team. A lot of different practice areas have to collaborate with a lot of other practice areas. So you might say, you work in patent litigation. Do you ever collaborate on privacy issues with your privacy team? That's an area of law I'm really interested in because I'm taking, X seminar at my law school right now. And they might say, yeah, I do work with our privacy team. I worked with them recently on this matter. And we have a really fantastic, senior associate who's a colleague of mine, was in my summer class with me. And it's a really fantastic practice that we have. And that's a good way for you to kind of express that interest while also speaking to someone who's maybe not in the practice area. Like I said, that's your top choice. And then you can say, what is that senior associate's name? I would love to connect with them at another time. So, other people who work at the firm, even if it's not in your top choice practice area, have good connections with that firm and can point you in the right direction. And again, you can still make the most of that time with that attorney because that attorney probably goes back to work the next day, sends me an email, says, hi, Shereen, I was on campus at Berkeley yesterday. I met this really fantastic student. Their name is XYZ, and they told me that they are interested in learning more about their privacy practice. Can you put them in touch with fantastic privacy senior associate? So you can still utilize those opportunities to ask, kind of more general questions about the firm that you're interested in, the office that you're interested in, and also get good direction on where to go next if you want to explore more in that area.
But one of the questions I love being asked actually, because it was an easy answer for me, but I could see where it could develop a lot of good conversations. It's like, well, I do patent litigation. Were you always a patent litigator? In today's world, you find people have changed practice groups, or it's evolved over time. There's just an interesting way to learn something about it, and then there's that compare and contrast. Well, I do patent litigation now, but I started as a corporate lawyer. Oh, well, when did you make that change? How'd you make that change? Something really interesting, and people like to tell how they got to a certain spot. It's always a fun question. But what I would encourage people is not to discard somebody. Oh, you're a patent litigator. Thank you, and done with you. Because there's a lot of information there about the firm. Like you said, you could ask about the firm culture, how you work with other people in your office. I mean, some groups are isolated. Patent litigation tends to be one that doesn't do a lot of cross staffing in other groups. I think Wilson's really interesting in its privacy. So somebody said, I do general litigation. So, well, that's interesting. I was looking at privacy litigation. How does that fit into your group? Well, I don't do privacy litigation, but my colleagues in the offices around me specialize in it. And you'd find out that, hey, well, Wilson privacy litigation sets in litigation, not in privacy. That kind of exploration will do a lot. Then when you show up for an interview, you already know something that 95% of the other candidates don't. So the other thing that you ask about, and you mentioned that I don't think students catch all the time, is this idea of cross group work. That I hadn't thought about it, but people tend to think I'm in this group, I work here, and I work here, and I work here. But the reality is most practices have blurry borders. And I think your tax practice is a perfect example. Though it's its own practice, it works across corporate, it works across tech transactions. It's just, it helps everybody. So that is a really good question to ask about how do you interact with other groups, or how, I'm interested in X. How does your group interact with them? But the culture ones are great because if you get to ask these questions to see if everybody answers the same culture questions the same. What do you do with mentoring? What do you do with attorney development? How do you do review processes? Those kinds of things. What do you see has worked? What do you see that hasn't worked? It's important. Everybody's got a piece of information from their viewpoint, and no one's trying to mislead you. But not everybody's viewpoint is necessarily useful or correct. They see their world. I started my firm in a group that was spectacular. The people were wonderful. The firm structure had a lot to be desired. Firm structure was problematic, but the people were great. But they'd all lateraled over from another firm, and they had kept their culture. And I didn't catch that until I showed up at the firm, and it meant our group was isolated because it didn't fit in with the other groups. Luckily, we were 100 people, so isolation wasn't terrible. But I didn't know what questions to ask to ever smoke that out. In retrospect, now looking back, it was obvious, but I didn't know. I would have been better off if I would have asked general litigators, how does this work for you? Then I would have seen the difference. So, yeah. Well, so another thing that you mentioned there is these questions don't go unnoticed or unreported. That's the standard process. So I would love to have your view of what happens on the firm side after these networking events. Is it just going to a black hole? No one talks about it anymore?
That is an excellent question. And no, it definitely does not go into a black hole. Anytime I organize an on-campus event, the very next day, I follow up with the attorneys that I sent on campus if I wasn't on campus myself. Sometimes, the recruiters are there and witnessing everything themselves. Sometimes the attorneys go alone. So in an event where the attorneys did go alone, I follow up with them the next day and say, thank you so much for doing that event last night. Did you meet anyone who really caught your attention, who really seemed like they could be a good fit for the firm? And then the attorneys will usually kind of give me a breakdown of who they met, who they found engaging, people that we might want to stay in touch with as we look ahead to hiring for 1L summer. So these events really do matter. And sometimes an attorney will meet someone who was just so absolutely fantastic that before I have the opportunity to even, reach out and see what they thought, they'll come to me and said, I met so-and-so at Berkeley Law. They were an absolute standout, asked really thoughtful questions, had such an interesting background that really aligned with what we're looking for at the firm. We should keep in touch. And then a lot of the times, if they bring a student like that to me, I'll reach out. I'll send an email. I'll say, hi, I'm a recruiter at Wilson Sonsini. One of my associates met you at an event last night. And they thought you might be interested in learning more about our firm. I might share some, documents that have information about our summer program, or if we're actively hiring at that time, our hiring opportunities, and say, if you ever want to jump on a call, I'm happy to do so. Or maybe if during their conversation they mentioned that they were interested in speaking to more attorneys, I might offer to arrange those conversations. And on the flip side, in the event that a student really maybe makes a not so great impression, one that was notably not so great, that's also something that gets reported back to me. Hey, I had a really great time at the event last night. I met a lot of really great students, but there was one student in particular who, maybe, said some inappropriate things, or was speaking poorly about other firms, or maybe made an offensive comment to the attorney that was on campus, or something along those lines. And they'll just say, keep this in mind if this person ever applies, to our summer program or job opportunities down the way. And that's usually reserved for cases where the person really did something that stood out in a negative way. It's not, I don't want, 1Ls to leave this video giving the impression that if they, didn't do their absolute best networking, that it's going to stay on their record for forever, because it definitely doesn't work like that. But it is a cautionary tale, and just being mindful of what you say, because attorneys are very personable. And so it can be easy to kind of get into a line of conversation with them that feels really friendly. And so then maybe you kind of, slip out of your more professional conversation skills and into something a little bit more social seeming, where you let your certain things slip through that you maybe otherwise would not in a networking conversation. So it's just something to be mindful of, that this information really does stay within the firm, and that attorneys are really being proactive about reporting both, standout students for good reasons and standout students for not so good reasons.
So I'm sure this has never happened to you, but occasionally lawyers come back and say, I met this really great student, perfect candidate, no idea, can't remember the name. Nobody's got cards, so figure out who that person is. What would you recommend? I mean, look, we all forget names, some of us more than others. What would you recommend for the student that had a good conversation? How do they kind of follow up, make sure that their information is there in case somebody forgets them, or maybe encourage the lawyer to remember, maybe they ran to a deposition, the airplane to take a deposition for 3 days and didn't have the ability to follow up with you. And then at that point in time, memories aren't as fresh. What could a student do to follow up on a good conversation?
No, that's a really great question. I think it's twofold. And I think as a student, the number one thing you can do to make sure that the attorney, doesn't forget your name or that you don't get lost in the shuffle, is to send, it doesn't have to be anything super long, but a thoughtful, follow-up email to the attorney that you spoke with. So that can be something along the lines of, hi, name of attorney, I really enjoyed listening to you speak about your tax practice at, our transactional law societies. Event last night in particular, it was really interesting to learn, and then add in a detail that's specific, so that they can tell that you aren't just sending a generic BCC email to everyone who was at the event. Add in a detail that shows that you paid attention. And then attach your resume. Say, I'm attaching my resume in case further opportunities come up at your firm. I would love to stay in touch. And something along those lines, so that they have your name and your contact information and know, that you really were paying attention last night. If you send that email and you get an out of office reply, and it seems like they're going to be a little bit out of pocket for a while, but you still want to be in touch with the firm, that's when you reach out to me. You go on our website, look up the recruiting contacts for maybe the office you're interested in, or, if, some firms don't have a local recruiter for every single office. So maybe it's, a general recruiting contact for the firm. You say, hi, name of recruiting contact. I was on campus at Berkeley last night. I met a really fantastic attorney and I enjoyed our conversation. I would love to keep in touch with Wilson Sonsini or whatever firm it is you're reaching out to in the future. If you have any other events coming up, I would love to attend those. And, if there's someone that you want to speak to, let the recruiter know. Say, I really enjoyed learning about your tax practice, but I would also love to speak to someone who does capital markets work, if you are able to point me in the direction of someone who does that. So I would say the best way for a student to make sure that their name doesn't slip through the cracks is just to send a quick email. It doesn't have to be any more than like 3 to 5 sentences, but it's a good way to make sure that your contact information is there, and that both the attorney and the recruiting staff are thinking of you.
So purely my perspective here, and I'm thinking about my practice as you said that, when I would get that, I'd go to events, I'd get an email from students, and usually, I may have been the one forgetting names because I'm moving on to a deposition, going to a plane, different things, and I'm always trying to, scratch it together later on. But I always loved it. I'd see these emails come in. Any email that came from a student, I always forwarded it to the recruiting department. Always just forwarded, sometimes without comment, just forwarded, said, here you go. But the email was never what would impress me. It would be, I do remember that conversation. I liked speaking with that student. There were some good questions. And usually I would hit forward with someone to consider, just something like that, that would then put that resume in the piles to be kind of elevated up. That is the one thing partners can do at a level a little more aggressive than a mid-level associate, is just say, I'd like to follow up. I'm not going to say I'm going to hire, but I'd like to follow up with this student.
Right.
And but it was always easy for me when somebody would remind me of that conversation. They weren't wowing me with an essay about what I said. They were just reminding me, hey, we had a good conversation.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I wanted to then basically continue that conversation. So it was just enough of a teaser, or I thought, this person seemed really interesting. I'd like my colleagues to have a chance to talk with this person and see if, you know, if everybody has that feeling.
Mhm.
So it's, again, not a multi-page email. If you send a multi-page email, that would probably tell me something in itself.
Yes, correct.
So, well, maybe close this out with, what types of questions make sense in these networking events? We talked a little bit about it if you're in different practice groups, but what should you be asking? What shouldn't you be asking at this point in time? Kind of what are your goals for a typical networking conversation with an attorney?
Yeah, I think going into any networking conversation, especially if it's one that you've kind of scheduled in advance with an attorney that you've intentionally selected or that maybe recruiting has connected you to because it seems like, they're sort of up your alley in terms of what you're interested in. You want to go into that conversation prepared. And that doesn't have to be, days of preparation, but if I set you up with a corporate attorney and your first question on the call is, so what kind of law do you practice? They're going to be a bit taken aback and feel like maybe you're not there to best utilize both your and their time. So especially if you know who you're going to be meeting with beforehand, you want to do a little bit of research and you want the questions you ask to be tailored to both the person you're speaking to and the firm you're speaking to. And really the goal for you in this conversation should be a little bit twofold. You know, on one hand, you want to get as much useful information out of this conversation as you can. So if you've really come here to learn what it's like to practice tax law or privacy law or patent litigation, you want to ask questions that are going to help you probe that interest, but you also want to make sure to be speaking about yourself, because if the attorney is talking the entire time and you're just saying, they're not going to leave with any impression of who you are. And it's not that they're not going to remember the conversation necessarily, but when they look back on it, say I get an application for you for the summer program and I know that you spoke to one of our attorneys and I go back to them and say, what did you think of this student? And they're going to say, well, I don't really remember because they didn't say much. So you want to be asking thoughtful questions that help you, but you also want to be able to add in a little bit of your own personal background and your resume when you're asking this question. So if you're speaking to that corporate attorney, instead of asking, so what do you do? A really good question might be, I read your bio a little bit. I see that most of your practice is focused on capital markets transactions within the biotechnology space. Can you tell me about what led you to that practice area? What made you want to work with biotech clients specifically? What drew you to capital markets over, M&A or emerging companies work? Things that show that you've read their bio and that you're asking thoughtful questions. Questions that are also going to be really helpful to one else is, let's be honest, there are hundreds of firms out there. And especially when you're first approaching them, they can all kind of seem similar. So it's good to have a few questions that you're asking, to every firm that you speak to so that you can have a comparison point. So that might be, asking questions about what opportunities are there, for development? And this is a good question to ask to associates specifically. What opportunities are there for development for associates at this firm in terms of training opportunities and things like that? Or, what direction do you see, this practice group heading in? Things like that, so that you can get at least some sort of base litmus test between the different attorneys at different firms you're talking to, so you can help distinguish them a little bit. And, there are obviously, like we talked a little bit about earlier, much more to a firm than just the practice area. So it might be, if you're interested in working on collaborative teams, some firms are a little bit siloed in how their practice groups are developed. So you might want to ask that question, do you, work on cross-disciplinary teams? How often do you work with people outside of the corporate department? What opportunities are there to work with attorneys outside of the San Diego office or the Seattle office or whatever office it is that the attorney works in. And then, if you're interested in, things outside of your, day-to-day practice, pro bono is important to you. You might read in the attorney's bio that they do a lot of work with asylum seekers. Maybe that's an area that you're really interested in. You might say, I see that you do a lot of pro bono work with asylum seekers. How did you get involved in that? What opportunities are there for junior associates to do the same? So really my biggest tip of advice is, if you're able to prepare in advance for the conversation you're having, make sure that you are asking thoughtful questions, because when attorneys come to me and they say, I talked to this student and they were awesome, one of the number one things they say is that they really asked intelligent, and thoughtful questions that showed a genuine engagement in the firm. It didn't seem like this was, one of 60 networking conversations the student was having and just asking the exact same thing every single conversation. There are some, like I said, comparative questions that you do want to ask the various people you talk to, but if you can be specific, that's really going to, land with the attorney or recruiter that you're speaking to. And, like I mentioned earlier, it's also important if they say, oh, I originally thought I was going to be a tax attorney, but I, tried that out as a junior associate and I found that I liked general corporate work a lot more. You can, bring up some things like, oh, I'm in a tax class right now, and it also, has been really interesting to me, but I'm curious to know more about, why you opted for corporate over tax or something along those lines. So make sure that you're adding in details from your resume, your background, the classes you're taking, et cetera, and, adding some of your own thoughts into the conversation again, so the attorney doesn't leave feeling like it was entirely one-sided.
That's so true. I mean, I was always impressed when people had good questions to ask. And to be fair, it's not easy to understand law firm websites. They're written for clients, maybe they're a little broad, so you can't understand exactly what people do day to day, but they always give some foundation for asking those first questions to get started. So, I see on your website you do patent litigation, trade secret litigation, copyright litigation, and trademark litigation. It's like, well, yes, I've done them all over some period of time, but 95% is spent here and here. The copyright litigation, I've done a few of those here and there, but that's once every other year. Oh, okay, good, because I'm interested in this piece over here. Or I am interested in the copyright litigation. If you don't do that, who does it? It's a great follow-up question. You're not going to insult somebody by saying, well, you're not a very good tax lawyer. I hope not. I'm a trial lawyer. And if I'm a good tax lawyer, I'm probably not a good trial lawyer. People are happy to explain their variations in practice, but websites are hard. But I don't think I ever faulted anyone for asking me a question that relied on the website. Like, yeah, I can do copyright litigation, not my bread and butter. And it's a conversation piece to get started right there. And I'd probably remember you for asking about that. Probably guarantee you I'd remember you for it. The one place I would say make sure you're prepared. So a lot of times I'd interview last, and I'd go talk to the associates before, and again, associates, I wanted their opinion. Like this person, not. And they'd be like, yeah, I do like this person. I think this would be a great person for a callback or a great person for X, Y, and Z. And so I trusted them, trusted my team 100%. If they said that's who I want to hire, that's who we're going to hire. So my opening statement would be, everybody loves you. So what can I tell you about the firm? What do you want to know? And open it up from there so every question could be answered. And I could tell everything I needed to know by the next thing that was said. When they didn't have any more questions or didn't have anything to add, I'm like, that's strange. But others would ask questions like, how do you interact with your team? How do they interact with each other? What's the mentoring cycle? And perfect questions. And occasionally you may have to carry a little conversation, and you better have the questions to do it. Nothing worse than a 30-minute interview that ends at 15 minutes.
Very, very true.
So, but no, I love your point about the goal is to work your piece in to those, that I'm taking the tax class, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm part of this group, we're putting on this conference. It's a great way to work in what you're doing also. So maybe the last question, and I don't want anybody to walk away thinking that, man, I've got to be outgoing, I've got to be an extrovert, I've got to be charming and funny to have a chance with any of these firms. And anybody that's worked with patent litigators know that that's not true. We're neither charming nor funny. So for those that are a little bit on the shy side, how do you help them make sure they're not overlooked, or I know you do a lot with the lawyers to make sure the lawyers are not part of the problem there and that they're being inclusive and bringing people into conversation. But how do you help yourself if you're a little bit on the shy side?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and one that resonates with me because I identify as an introvert. I think I can be a bit shy at times, which is often a little bit counterintuitive because I think people think of recruiters as being the ultimate extroverts. So I first want to provide some reassurance that I think statistically most attorneys are actually introverts. So it's definitely not something that's being held against you when you enter these networking spaces. I think especially like if this is your first event, maybe you're at like a networking sort of reception or some like a bigger event at your school, the recruiters, again, shameless plug, great first people to go to. We tend to be extremely approachable because we want to help you. So if you're at an event and you don't know who to approach, but you see someone that has a badge that says attorney recruiting, come up to me, ask me a little bit about my firm and then say, who here is one of your attorneys? Is there anyone that you would recommend that I talk to? And I will come up and I will say, this is Natalie Morgan. She is a partner in our patent litigation group. She would love to speak to you about our patent litigation practice if that's who you tell me that you want to talk to. So if you're at an event where recruiters are available, I think they're a great first option there. Another way, especially if it's again at an event where it's the onus is really on you, to go up to attorneys and say hi and introduce yourself. I would provide the reassurance that attorneys are extremely friendly and they are on campus because they want to talk to you. I don't send any attorneys on campus who do not want to talk to students. And for the most part, almost every single attorney at my firm does want to talk to students. So if you say, hi, I see on your badge that you're from Wilson Sonsini. I've been reading a lot about Wilson Sonsini as I've been researching firms. I would love to talk to you. That's a great introduction, and you can get the conversation going from there. If you find it hard, to start those conversations at in-person networking events, I think those sort of cold emailing that I talked about earlier, finding an attorney on a website who seems interesting to you might be an easier way for you to go, at least as you're kind of getting your feet warm. Because you can identify someone who you're really interested in speaking with and have a conversation that will be a one-on-one conversation with them. Get used to what that conversation looks like. And that way, maybe as you head into your spring semester, now that you've had a few of these, we call them coffee chats a lot of the time, they usually take place on Zoom. Now that you've had a few coffee chats and know what it's like to talk to an attorney, when you head to whatever spring networking reception your school has, you have a lot more confidence in speaking with attorneys. So my top two tips would be take advantage of recruiters, and if in-person networking events are still something you're getting used to, take advantage of opportunities to speak one-on-one by doing outreach for coffee chats and things like that.
Well, and we put on several events through the year through the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology that give people a chance to start mingling in lower pressure environments. A couple in the fall, and then bigger ones in the spring. Some formal tabling events, some just less formal people sharing appetizers and drinks. So I would add, take advantage of those opportunities. Networking was never easy for me. But like a lot of things, you build either tolerance for it if you are shy, or you build a skill set to get over any kind of fears. And I wasn't shy, but I was fearful that, I had a little bit of that imposter syndrome. And a couple of practice runs does wonders. So take advantage of some of those opportunities on that. And I think you can grow into whatever role you want. Same thing happens for partners and client development. It's hard to ask for work that first time, but after a while it becomes second nature. It just becomes what you do. But it's a learned skill, not a skill you're born with.
100%.
So, well, wonderful. Well, I look forward to seeing you at our events, and I appreciate you sharing your time with our students and with other students around the country. Wilson's been very generous with that time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
Take care.